Today we'll be discussing the creation of an English empire in the Atlantic world. Let's begin with a deeper look at an island closest to home, Ireland. English claims to overlordship in Ireland date back to the 12th century, but as we saw in Scotland, and will continue to see for the rest of the course, claims to overlordship and actual power are two very different things. Like Scotland, Ireland was divided into clans. There was an overall king of Ireland who was crowned at the ceremonial site known as the Hill of Tara, but the Irish king had even less power than his Scottish counterpart, with clan chiefs in Ireland usually being recognized as kings in their own right. Such monarchs include the King of Connaught and the King of Leinster in the west, petty kings and kingdoms that continually feuded with one another. In 1166, the King of Leinster, a man named Diarmaid MacMulloch, was overthrown by the King of Connaught and traveled to England to ask for the English King Henry II's help in recovering his kingdom. Henry II politely declined, telling MacMulloch that he didn't have the resources or the men to spare for a far-off adventure in Ireland. MacMulloch, though, wasn't ready to give up. He approached an English knight named Richard de Clare, a renowned warrior who was then out of favor at the English court. De Clare is better known as Strongbow, and with a name like that, you can probably guess which weapon he was good at using. MacMulloch made him a deal. If he could raise a body of men at his own expense and help in reclaiming MacMulloch's kingdom, the MacMulloch would marry Strongbow to his daughter Ava, and since MacMulloch himself had no sons, Strongbow would succeed him as King of Leinster. This arrangement worked out for Strongbow. He raised a small army, crossed over to Ireland, and defeated the King of Connaught. And he was dutifully married to Ava, and at MacMulloch's death shortly thereafter, made King of Leinster. This did not sit well with Henry. It was one thing not to be interested in helping some random king in Ireland to reclaim his throne, but it was quite another to have one of your own subjects leave your kingdom and create one of his own. Henry II invaded Ireland in response. Strongbow saw the writing on the wall and surrendered without a fight. From then on, he would hold his territories as a lord only, with Henry II recognized as his king. This would give rise to what would become known as the Strongbow rule, which undergirded British policy toward overmighty subjects for the rest of the empire, 800 years on. It held that any subject of the English and then the British crown always remained a subject of that crown, no matter where they were in the world or how long ago they had left. This was the legal basement for impressment during the late 18th and early 19th centuries, when the British Navy would search American ships for British subjects. It didn't matter that some of them had left England more than 20 years earlier. As long as you were born in England, you were always British, no matter what. Colonies could not declare independence or recognize another sovereign. No matter how powerful the East India Company would become in India, or the Royal Africa Company in Africa, or colonial governors anywhere, they always remained subject to the British Crown, even if they were operating in another state. Strongbow was followed in Ireland by other English lords, who were keen to carve out possessions for themselves, though they always made sure that they claimed to act on behalf of the English king. They fought Irish clans and slowly extended English rule in Ireland, but the process was long and frequently looked as if it would go in the other direction. Henry II assumed overlordship over the territory around Dublin, and his successors tenaciously held on to this, even as other Anglo-Irish lordships fell to Gaelic clans during the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries. The Irish clans very steadily extended their rule eastward. The area of English power became known as the Pale, a small area around Dublin, and as Irish culture increasingly came to be seen as barbaric by the English regarded the Pale as a lone outpost of civility in an otherwise benighted land. This gave rise to the expression beyond the Pale, as meaning something unacceptable or ignorant. Like the Scottish Highlands, however, the Reformation would transform the relationship between the English crown and Ireland. Irish clans generally remained Catholic, much for the same reason as those did in Scotland as well. English armies didn't do all that much to expand their hold through the Middle Ages. They would defend the Pale, but couldn't see a reason to wage expensive wars to conquer the whole island. Again, the difference in overlordship in theory and practical power in reality. After the Reformation, however, France and Spain saw Ireland as an ideal base to launch assaults on England, and the English government sought to close what ministers referred to as England's back door. Under Elizabeth I, the English government launched expensive plantation schemes to quote-unquote civilize the inhabitants and bring in the Protestant religion. This worked much the same way as it did in Scotland. Some of the most famous, often mythological heroes of English history engaged in such schemes. Men like Sir Walter Raleigh, who would later found Roanoke in what now is North Carolina, and Sir Francis Drake, who made a name for himself attacking the Spanish as a sea dog who stole treasure. The most important plantation scheme was led by a man named Edmund Spencer, who sponsored a huge plantation in southern Ireland near the city of Cork. He threw Irish peasants off their lands, mostly by burning their crops and waiting for them to starve. Here's Spencer celebrating his efforts in a pamphlet he published in 1596 called A View of the Present State of Ireland. Spencer took pity on some of the dispossessed and allowed them to work as servile laborers on English plantations, but he banned them from teaching Irish to their children on the grounds that doing so would preserve a barbaric tongue. So that the speech being Irish, he said, the heart must needs be Irish. As you can imagine, English plantations would eventually provoke a furious backlash in Ireland. The Crown attempted to buy off the Irish elite in much the same way as they had done in the Highlands, offering noble titles and making local aristocrats responsible for civilizing the inhabitants of their own lands, which were otherwise safe from English encroachment. So the chief of the O'Neills, based in Ulster, became the Earl of Tyrone. The chief of the O'Donnells would become the Earl of Tyrconnell, and so on, granting English titles and English-style property law for their estates in exchange for loyalty. But for Hugh O'Neill, a staunch Catholic and a man proud of his Gaelic heritage, using these titles was nothing more than selling out. In the 1590s, he led a massive rebellion in Northern Ireland against the English, and eventually united most of the clans throughout the entire island. The rebels attacked English plantations wherever they found them, and almost completely wiped out Spencer's plantation around Cork. O'Neill contacted the Spanish for assistance as fellow Catholics, and proclaimed himself a vassal of the King of Spain, Philip II, and a loyal subject of the Pope. The Spanish sent 3,500 troops to Ireland, where they joined an army of about 16,000 Irish. The rebels fought for 9 years, defeating one English army after another, before they finally faced a combined land and naval force at the Battle of Kinsale in 1602. It was the largest battle ever fought to that point in Ireland, and it ended in a resounding English victory. Hugh O'Neill found that he had no choice but to surrender. Receiving fairly generous terms, O'Neill went back to Ulster and promptly started planning another rebellion. But when the English were on the verge of discovering this second conspiracy, he and many of his leading followers fled for the continent. This became known as the Flight of the Earls, and it was one of the most important moments in Irish and imperial history. O'Neill left in 1607, thinking that he could muster support in France and Spain for another effort against England. But his previous campaign had failed despite all the blood and treasure that his foreign allies had spent, and they were unwilling to help him. O'Neill governed almost the entire region of Ulster in the north, and since he had now left, the English crown declared his lands forfeit and decided to rule them in his stead. James VI of Scotland was now on the throne of England, and he decided to plant Ulster with Protestant settlers. And this time, there was vastly more land available to plant than anyone like Spencer or Raleigh would have imagined. O'Neill's departure left a power vacuum over a full quarter of Irish territory, and tens of thousands of Protestant settlers, from England, but especially from lowland Scotland, poured into Ulster. This was the beginning of the sectarian tensions that would plague British rule in Ireland, and indeed marked the very creation of Northern Ireland as a place apart. 80,000 settlers came in the decades following 1609. This was the plantation scheme that worked.